In early 2016, one of the largest and oldest automotive brands in the entire world, known as Ford Motors, announced that it was pulling out of Indonesia, a country that holds one of the world's largest populations and one of the fastest-growing auto markets. This has then raised questions around the archipelago country. Has Ford Motors failed in breaking into the Indonesian auto market? Or has the Indonesian market failed Ford Motors? These questions were raised by netizens of Indonesia. The announcement was even an immediate pullout, which cited that by the end of the year, Ford Motors would be closing all operations in the country, shuttering dealerships, and stopping both sales and imports. While there could be a number of reasons why they are pulling out of the Indonesian market, it still proved one factor: the failure of an American giant in staying in one of the world's largest auto markets. 6 years later, however, Ford Motors would return and once again try to figure out the Indonesian market with a newly embedded management, strategy, and vehicle lineup. But let us not get into that yet. Let us first address the fact that while Ford Motors exited the country in 2016, it was also not the only American automaker that would do so. 4 years later, by 2020, General Motors, which is yet again a massive automotive company and had been operating in Indonesia for decades at that point, had also announced that it would exit the archipelago country, leaving the market competition to the European, Japanese, and South Korean companies. Two major automotive giants who are on their own have been regarded to be prominent automotive companies for decades. They are also known as first movers and are amongst the oldest automotive companies in the Western world. Ford, for instance, was a $50 billion company around 2016, whereas General Motors was also valued at a similar level at $50 billion at the time of their exit announcement. These two companies, therefore, were collectively a $100 billion plus company. Leaving one of the most important markets in the entire world, Indonesia, does not only signal that they have given up on a future opportunity, but one could also easily state that the American auto manufacturers are now long gone, and they have left the entire market to the remaining European auto companies such as BMW, Mercedes, along with the Japanese companies such as Toyota and Honda, and South Korean companies such as Hyundai. Another cause of concern could also be the growing market force of Chinese automotive brands, which have been seeking to expand their operations in Indonesia. So let us first begin with the video's question: why did America's largest automotive brands fail in Indonesia? Was the exit of two major American auto companies due to, say, the weak Indonesian market? Or was it due to the failure of their strategies in encapsulating a big market share? Well, let us understand more about the exit of these two companies and what truly failed them. Back in the late 1920s, the American giant General Motors entered the archipelago country as one of the earliest automakers in the country, incorporating the company as NV General Motors Java Handel Maatschappij under the laws of Dutch East Indies on February 3, 1927. The company was one of the first movers in the entire Indonesian auto market, and had they continued these operations, they would have been a century-old company by 2027. A grand scale that meant that they almost had a century-long experience in selling their vehicles to Indonesians. However, that would not have been the story due to the fact that it had gone into liquidation in the mid-1950s. Throughout decades of operations prior to the liquidation, General Motors would still go on to sell thousands upon thousands of automotive vehicles and products to millions of Indonesians. Vehicle prices back then, however, were mostly bought by affluent families, with little affordability given to the rest of the population. When 1956 came, General Motors' liquidation in Indonesia was put forward, and its assets and branches were sold to a local Indonesian auto company known as Gajah Motors. Gajah Motors, who purchased General Motors' Jakarta branch, was a considerable economic driver, as stated by historians and economists. On average, it was employing 1,012 Indonesian nationals in its factory and helped establish 41 dealers with 3,500 employees. As the automotive trend continues to grow and the Indonesian economy picks up as well, General Motors would then see yet again an opportunity in their eyes, announcing in the early 1990s their return by investing a whopping $110 million in the country. It would go on to build up its own manufacturing plant around Bekasi, West Java, a plant capable of producing 15,000 5,000 units annually. Throughout the next few decades, General Motors would side by side be challenged in a growing auto-competitive landscape. Japanese, European, and even its American competitor Ford would all come up by building their own plants, hiring the best engineers, and selling the best quality vehicles they can sell. Even though it had the right capital, the right people, and a very profound plant, it was still not enough, simply because Indonesia was a very strategic place for Japanese automakers. Just like how it is around Asia, Japanese automotive brands tend to dominate every country. However, Indonesia is quite special in this case. Indonesia stands as a very big overseas manufacturing base for Japanese brands, and they also see the massive future potential that it has to offer, arguably one of the most important places in the entire Asian continent. Therefore, Japanese automakers such as Toyota, Honda, and Mitsubishi would come to dominate the entire Indonesian automotive manufacturing landscape. Hence, by 2020, when General Motors would announce its exit, they attributed it to only one factor: poor performance. Years of poor performance were acknowledged by the Southeast Asian General Motors president. They had limited potential to grow their vehicles after the wide range of competitive Japanese automakers and even the recent entrance of Chinese automakers. They did everything they could. They refurbished their plants, they hired the best workers, but even in the early 2010s, they still could not do it. The company reported a massive loss of about $200 million in the years 2013 to 2014, and by 2018, the company only sold 2,500 vehicles, whereas by 2019, it sold far fewer at 958 units in the first 9 months. Poor performance, in simpler terms, was the factor that led the company to leave Indonesia. Poor performance from the company and much less from the Indonesian market. Their exit, however, did not officially mean that the company would never again re-enter. They would come back to the country after they signed a joint venture with its Chinese counterparts, which was done just recently. Ford, on the other hand, had actually a similar entrance and exit. When Ford Motors entered Indonesia around the 1950s, it sought to dominate the entire Indonesian automotive industry. Throughout the decades, however, it too found that the industry was already being fought by foreign brands. That did not stop them, and by July 12, 2000, Ford Motors Indonesia would be established as part of its continued strategy to grow its presence in Indonesia. Suddenly, by 2002, it had stepped into the spotlight by launching a number of vehicles and dealers around the country. At one point, the company would also see its vehicle join the top 10 best-selling cars in the country prior to the 21st century. Fast forward to 2015, the company, after launching a number of strategies, would only help them sell over 4,986 units on a wholesale basis, meaning from factories to dealers. It was at this moment, however, that despite having a huge unit volume of sales, almost double that of General Motors, the company would signal an exit. It might also be because of the fact that 5,000 units were not really that much. For comparison, the entire car sales in Indonesia was a whopping 1 million in 2015, whereas Toyota's plants had the production capacity to produce over 250,000 units in a single year. Hence, in exactly a year after selling nearly 5,000 units, the company would decide to close all operations. This would then lead us to believe that their reasons were almost the same as General Motors, and as the company stated in its official announcement, quote, "It sees no reasonable path for profitability amid intense competition against Japanese rival makers. It makes extreme sense for them to do so." And for a better view, despite having 5,000 unit sales, it was only 0.6% of the entire Indonesian market share. Fast forward to mid-2022, Ford Motors would yet again return to Indonesia, this time planning to recoup its losses from Japanese car makers, but who knows what will happen to them in the future. In summary, the failure of American-branded cars in Indonesia was simply because they were in the middle of tough competition, a competition that was won by Japanese cars and much less by any other. But the highly dominant Japanese-based markets were not the only sole factor here. It can be argued that Chinese automakers were also on the rise in Indonesia. Indonesia was, after all, starting to dwindle its focus to China, luring in more investments and more bilateral cooperation and partnership. Through this aspect, there truly may be no strategy that these American giants can do other than leave the markets. But anyway, the future was due to a lack of proper strategy and strong competition. But is that really all there is to it? Let us know what you think down below. Thanks for watching.